And okay, I think we're ready. So Daniel, please go ahead and give us your presentation.
All right, thank you. So hello everyone, my name's Daniel. I'm a first year PhD student at the University of Sydney, and today I want to talk to you about the process of charge separation. And what I hope to convince you by the end of the talk is that a little bit of delocalization goes a really long way to enhancing the efficiency at which charges separate. But I actually want to start today's talk not looking at the charge separation problem, but looking at the charge transport problem. So how does one charge move through material? And so for some of you, this might seem a little bit familiar. I spoke about this at the conference last year. And so for this half of the talk, I want to introduce you to the new theory I've developed called Delocalised kinetic Monte Carlo. And what this does is it allows us to model the way that charges move in the intermediate range of disorder for the first time in 3 dimensions, including important things like disorder, delocalization, and Polaron formation. And then what I want to do for the second half of the talk is move on to the charge separation problem. So not how does one particle move through a material, but how do kind of 2 charges separate inside organic photovoltaics. And so what I hope to convince you in that half of the talk is that, again, a little bit of delocalization goes a long way to enhancing the efficiency at which charges separate. And so I'm going to start by looking at the charge transport problem. And we understand how charges move or are transported in 2 extremes really well. And so the first of which is if we start with a highly ordered material. And what I mean by an ordered material is you have molecules that are regularly arranged in space. They all have the same energy. And so this allows the electronic state to periodically and infinitely extend through your material. And so charges move through these bands in what is well known as band conduction. And this is commonly used to describe how charges move through many conductors, things such as metals. And then in the other extreme, we have materials that are highly disordered. So they have irregular arrangement of molecules. They each have their own energy. And this causes those electronic states to become localized onto individual molecules. And therefore, the only way that a charge can move is via a thermally assisted hop to its neighbor, where the energy for that hop is provided by vibrations in the environment. And so this is the way that is kind of commonly charges are commonly described to move through organic semiconductors. And so we can kind of see that happening in this picture here. So we have a bunch of fullerene molecules. We have an electron hopping to its nearest neighbor with rate k, and the energy of these kind of molecules are disordered, and so they kind of form a Gaussian distribution of energies. But the problem with these, and the rate at which these hops can occur, often given by kind of a Marcus rate or a Miller-Abrahams rate, where you've got some hopping prefactor and then an exponential describing kind of the thermal activation of hops. But the problem with this picture of the way charge is moving is we need really high hopping prefactors to match many experimental mobilities to the hopping theory. And in fact, we need hopping prefactors up to 10 to the 15 hops per second. And the problem with this is those are actually faster than the vibrations that are occurring in the system. And so if we're saying these hops are thermally activated, they can't be occurring faster than the hops that are producing them, than the vibrations that are producing them. And so we must be missing some of the kind of fundamental physics of how charges are moving through these materials. And that's because we're not including delocalization. And that's because organic semiconductors aren't perfectly disordered. Instead, they lie in this kind of tricky intermediate regime with a bunch of other materials that we don't have a particularly good description of how charges move through them. And so today I want to convince you that the way charges move in this tricky intermediate regime is the hopping between partially delocalized electronic states, where the kind of rate of movement between any 2 electronic states depends on the overlap between them. And so we're going to start by thinking about what the important ingredients we need to include in our model and include inside our Hamiltonian. And so here we have a series of sites, which you can think about as a molecule or part of maybe a small molecule or part of a longer polymer chain. But we're going to assign an energy to each of those sites. And these energies are assigned from, again, that Gaussian distribution with the width as the sigma, which we're going to call the disorder of our material. We then couple these sites to each other to their nearest neighbors with some coupling strength J. And then we place this system inside some environment. And we're going to put that inside a bath, which is kind of a series of harmonic oscillators that are vibrating. And we can think about this as like kind of our bonds vibrating in our environment. And these, of course, interact with our system, and the way that's modeled is by coupling every one of those sites to all of those vibrational frequencies with some coupling strength G. And this kind of linear coupling perturbs those site energies a little bit and kind of changes those energy levels. And so we kind of have these three parameters inside a Hamiltonian, which are going to control what our states look like, what those electronic states end up looking like. And so the first of which is our disorder, which is kind of the randomness of those energy levels, which is encouraging those electronic states to become localized. We have the coupling between nearest neighbors, which is encouraging delocalization across them. And then we have that coupling to the environment, which is perturbing those energies and further localizing the electronic states. And so far we've included the important effects of disorder and delocalization, but we also need to include the effect of Polaron formation. And so to introduce what the idea of a Polaron is, we're going to look at this kind of ionic lattice here, but it could be any type of material. And we're going to put a charge inside this lattice, and you're going to see that we're going to get a distortion to the environment. So you've got the anions moving away and the cations moving towards. And so I want us to think about these polarons as a quasi-particle that contains the charge and its distortion to the environment. And so as a charge moves, so does the distortion to the environment. And so we can treat this not as a charge transport problem, but as a Polaron transport problem. And the great thing about the Polaron transport problem is if I hide the details of what's going on inside this Polaron, it looks like it's weakly coupled to its environment. It's kind of weakly interacting with its environment because most of the system environment interaction is kind of hidden inside the Polaron or encapsulated inside the Polaron itself. And so this actually enables us to kind of to characterize the kinetics of this intermediate regime using the perturbative Redfield approach. And so to kind of summarize what's happening here, we're going to think about this grid, and the corners of these grids are those sites I talked about before. So we assign an energy to those, we couple them to their nearest neighbors, we apply the Polaron transformation and then diagonalize our Hamiltonian to give us these kind of funny Polaron states. And so the way that a kind of full master equation would track the way a charge moves through this material would be that it spreads to all the other states. And it kind of spreads to the ones that are close by and has a large overlap with a large amount and very quickly. And then the ones at the edge of the box would obviously spread slowly with a small amount. But the problem with this kind of approach is it's really, really expensive. And so it can only be applied in kind of small one-dimensional systems. So now I'm going to run through kind of the three roadblocks that stop us scaling this up to higher dimensions. And the approximations I've taken to kind of transform this idea into the new theory called delocalized kinetic Monte Carlo. So the first problem is that the amount of rates we have to calculate inside a master equation. And you see here that it quickly gets intractable in higher dimensions, even for a small system. And so the first approximation we're going to apply is kinetic Monte Carlo, which the idea is instead of spreading to all of those states, like in the master equation, we actually just move to one state. And we move to that state with probability proportional to the size of the rate. So we select the next state probabilistically, and then we continue this procedure until we reach some end condition, do this many times on the same kind of setup, and you average for the mean trajectory through the landscape. We're also going to apply a hopping radius, which says I'm only going to calculate rates that are that have centers within this hopping radius. And the kind of the motivation for this is the rates to the edge of the box are really, really small because the overlap between these states are small. And so we don't want to waste time calculating those if most of them are lying within some hopping radius. And so this allows us to track the dynamics in one dimension really, really fast, just on your computer. But we still can't move to 2D because of how expensive calculating a single rate is. And that's because we're summing over a huge amount of pairs of sites. And so in order to make these kind of calculations tractable, we're going to apply something called an overlap radius, which is essentially, instead of summing over all pairs of sites in a grid, we're only going to do pairs of sites within some that are simultaneously within some overlap radius of both states. And this has a huge computational saving that allows us to track these kind of trajectories through these large 2D grids, as you can see here. But we still can't move to 3D because of how expensive calculating just producing these blue states are, and because of how expensive diagonalizing a Hamiltonian is. And so if we want to do a fairly small Hamiltonian here in 3D, we're waiting an awfully long time to just get one single landscape to kind of, before we even track the trajectories through them. And so to overcome this idea, what we're going to do is we're going to diagonalize a Hamiltonian on the fly. So instead of diagonalizing our full Hamiltonian, we'll just diagonalize a small Hamiltonian surrounding our charge. We'll allow it to move through that box until we reach some boundary condition and then re-diagonalize that Hamiltonian. And so that finally takes us to the dKMC theory, which we see kind of happening in here as the kind of Hamiltonian box moves all over the place. And so this allows us to track the dynamics of charges moving in this intermediate regime in the full dimensions for the first time. And that's because we're able to drop the computational complexity by 25 orders of magnitude compared to that kind of full master equation. And so the kind of two important results from this dKMC model in the charge transport picture is that 3D effects and delocalization effects are really important to kind of accurately capturing the physics of transport. And so what we've got here is a plot of the delocalization length, which is kind of like how much these states spread in one direction. And we see that as a function of J, so the electronic coupling. And so we see that the delocalization in 3D is kind of significantly different than in the other dimensions. And we get these kind of really, really high delocalizations compared to the lower dimensional approximations. And then in this second plot, we're looking at how important delocalization is. So here we've got the mobilities as a function of the electronic coupling again. And so at the bottom here, we've got regular Monte Carlo, so just kinetic Monte Carlo. And then we've got delocalized kinetic Monte Carlo in each of the three dimensions. And so we see that at low couplings, you're getting an agreement between regular Monte Carlo and dKMC when there is no delocalization, the states are localized. But then as we kind of increase the electronic coupling and we turn on delocalization, we're getting a movement away from regular Monte Carlo. And we're seeing for these already modest J's of fairly low delocalization, less than kind of 2 sites in each direction, that we're already getting this kind of order of magnitude enhancement in mobilities. And you can see that you'd expect the 3D to be much greater again. And so now I'm going to move on to the charge separation picture. So not thinking about how a single particle moves, but how 2 particles move inside photovoltaics. And so we can think about this process. We get an excitation into an exciton, which moves towards an interface before we get charge transfer across that interface, and then those charges need to separate into free charges. And so we can think about the efficiency of that process as the kind of proportion of excitations that become separated. And that's known as the internal quantum efficiency. So do they separate before they kind of recombine back to the ground state? And one of the big questions in charge separation theory is, how are charges able to overcome a really strong Coulombic attraction so efficiently? And so what I mean by this is organic semiconductors have really low dielectric constants, which means their Coulombic interaction is really strong. And so at the CT state, we're producing a Coulombic barrier that's an order of 500 MeVs. So they sit inside this low energy well, and they need energy to escape it. And yet the amount of thermal energy we have is significantly lower than the size of this well. And so this is what I mean. At the CT state, these things are attracted to each other, and you need a significant amount of energy to kind of escape this well and to separate into free charges before they kind of recombine to the ground state. And yet we see really high IQEs inside organic photovoltaics. And the question kind of arises, how does this happen so efficiently despite this large well and this little amount of available thermal energy? And so one of the proposed answers for a while has been that delocalization helps. So here's a couple of papers from Richard Friend, which has experimentally suggested this. And again, here's a review from Jenny Nelson's group. And here's some proposed mechanisms, a nice figure suggesting some of the proposed mechanisms for why the efficiency is so high, and 3 of these kind of including delocalization. But to kind of answer this question has proven quite difficult, because a full kinetic model to track the charge separation problem is really complicated. And actually the complexity goes as the square of the single body problem. So if we thought the single body charge transport problem was hard, then the charge separation problem is even harder again. But what I'm going to talk about here is we want to be able to kind of apply the principles we saw in the for using dKMC to the charge transport problem and do a similar thing to the charge separation problem. And it's going to be quite similar, but we need a slightly different Hamiltonian to start. And so instead what we have here is we have some donor and acceptor molecules, and we have, instead of a single particle, we have two particles. And so the basis sites are pairs of sites where the energy is the energy of the electron in the LUMO minus the energy of the hole in the HUMO minus the kind of Coulomb interaction between the two. And then we couple these pairs of sites to other pairs of sites where either the electron or the hole moves. So not both at the same time, but one or the other. And we couple them with strength J. And then we're going to do a really similar thing that we did in the charge transport problem, but we're going to do it in the charge separation problem. So we're going to kind of take this master equation, this kind of really complicated master equation. We're going to map this onto kinetic Monte Carlo. We're going to apply those hopping kind of cutoffs. We're going to apply the overlap cutoffs, and then we're going to diagonalize our Hamiltonian on the fly. And by doing this, we're able to allow dKMC to track the charge separation problem, including those important effects of disorder, delocalization, and Polaron formation for the first time. And so we see that this has been enabled because the computational complexity here has been dropped by 35 orders of magnitude. And so we can see these kind of things separating here. And so I want to finish by looking at kind of some preliminary, three preliminary results were found using dKMC on the charge separation problem. And the first here is the IQE as a function of, again, the electronic coupling, comparing regular Monte Carlo with delocalized kinetic Monte Carlo. And we're seeing already at these fairly low couplings that we're getting some fairly large enhancements in the efficiency at which charges are separating already. So we're getting like threefold enhancement at fairly low couplings. And again, remember those delocalizations are quite small at these couplings. And so kind of the reasons why these enhancements are happening is, one, we're reducing the kind of Coulomb barrier as these states kind of spread, and the centers of these states are kind of further away than in the localized case. And we're also getting a kind of a small reduction in the recombination rate as these charges spread away from each other. And also we have the kind of tails of these electronic states kind of spilling out of the well to help these charges kind of get out of those large wells. The other result we looked at was kind of the temperature dependence of this separation. So here we've got the separation rate as a function of the inverse temperature. And quite a common thing here is you'll take the gradient of such a curve and look at the activation energy of the charge separation. And so here in the kind of really KMC case, the activation energy is about 90 MeVs. But then what we're seeing in the dKMC case is it's quite similar at high temperature, but then at this low temperature, we're getting these kind of higher than expected charge separation rates. And the reason for this is that the Polaron states we talked about before actually delocalize further at lower temperatures than they do at high temperatures. And so we're getting these kind of greater enhancements at low temperature than we are at high temperatures, because that delocalization is much more significant. And the last thing I want to talk about is that the initial state's really important. And so here we have or seems to be important. So again, we have the IQE as a function of J. Again, this KMC is the blue and the dKMC is the orange. But we have two different initial states here. We have hot CT states in the circles and thermalized CT states in the kind of diamonds here. And so what I mean by hot or thermalized CT states, we can kind of see over here. So we have all of the states' energies plotted as a function of the separation between the electron and the hole. And so you'll see these ones on the kind of left-hand side here that have a separation of 1. Those are our CT states. And they can kind of be a range of energies here. So you have these ones that are low down, and those are our thermalized CT states. And then the ones higher up in energy are kind of our hot CT states. And we're seeing, according to these dynamics, that the efficiency at which the hot CT states are separating is significantly different from the way that the thermalized CT states are separating. But in both cases, we're seeing an enhancement when we include delocalization. So in the thermalized and in the hot CT state, we see enhancements. And so I want to finish up by just kind of emphasizing the main points or the main take homes from today's talk. So one is that dKMC has enabled us to kind of track charge transport in this intermediate regime in the full 3 dimensions for the first time. And that's shown us that the delocalization and 3D effects are really important to kind of accurately capturing the physics of transporting these materials. And the second one is that we're able to use dKMC to model this charge separation problem, including, again, those important ingredients of delocalization, disorder, and polarons for the first time. And when we've shown that even small amounts of delocalization can make a very big difference to the efficiency at which charges are separating in these materials. So that's all I have. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Daniel. Very, very interesting talk. Would like to open up for questions from anyone from the audience. So please feel free. You just need to unmute your microphone and then you can ask a question.
Daniel, as always, I enjoy these lean of charge transport and everything else. So I may have asked the question when you gave the talk, but I can't remember. So that's a senior moment, if you like. In terms of your charge, your model of charges and movement of charges, it's essentially in the absence of any field, isn't it?
Yeah, correct.
So in terms of the complexity of the modeling, if you have it in the presence of a field, does that actually make it easier? Because one could imagine that rather than exploring 3-dimensional space in all directions, there would be propensity of charges potentially to move in one direction depending on the field. In fact, you could consider 3 regimes: the low field, intermediate field, and high field regimes. Can you deal with that with your model, or is that something that's...
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so it's completely, I've looked a little bit into this kind of this year, looking at, is there anything interesting that happens when we kind of put a field in this model? And it's quite easy. You just put like a kind of an energy gradient on your kind of site energies, and that's, it kind of doesn't change the complexity of doing this very much at all. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's definitely something that can be done, and I'm working on at the moment to see if anything interesting is happening, whether there's kind of some experimental signature of delocalized charge transport versus kind of localized charge transport, especially in because a field is something that's easily be controllable experimentally. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Could I ask something? It's Alan Mark speaking. Could I ask a related question?
Yeah, sure.
Paul was referring to a static field, but if we're thinking about the dielectric response, it could be also represented as an oscillating field or a randomly directional field, which I'm sorry, I was printing something in the background, which is why you might be able to hear some background noise. Do you think that that would enhance your rates even further? Because basically it would almost give you an enhanced effect of your delocalization. So if you had this in a randomly varying field.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure exactly what to expect, and I haven't looked at that. That is definitely something that could be checked. Sounds like you have a bit of an intuition about what would happen, but I'm not sure I've thought about it. Yeah.
Just because some of the hops will be, they have exponential terms in them, and so fluctuations in the local environment may make them even more favorable, exactly like your disorder makes them more favorable.
Hmm.
All right. I think we are running out of time. So David, I know I saw you just quickly unmute yourself. We might need to save that discussion for the end of this session, and we'll have to move on to our second speaker.